Good morning and welcome back to our study, Believe in Me, Jesus in the Gospel of John. So we are in lesson 5 today, which means after today's lesson, we will be halfway through our study and not halfway through the book of John, even though I've been rushing us along and skipping things, which I find very personally painful. But we will be halfway through the study. And so today we're going to be in chapters 5 through 7 for Jesus' healing of the man at the pool of Bethesda. But before we do that, let's review last week in which Jesus was at the well with the Samaritan woman. So what stood out to you about that lesson or the interaction of Jesus with the woman?
It seems like at that point, he was really setting aside pretty much all cultural biases to interact with her. So a lot of gender, ethnicity,
right,
etc.
really went against the grain.
Yes.
So Jesus had, and we saw his emphasis. He had to go through Samaria, and then we saw him choose to sort of, cut through the traditional barriers that they had to communicate in order to have this conversation with the woman. Yeah. What else?
I think she knew enough about the teachings of the prophets to be able to say, I think you're the Messiah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she started out, she obviously had no way to know who Jesus was before they began this conversation. And yet we saw her very quickly make her way to the correct conclusion about who Jesus is. And so I see you're a prophet. And when the Messiah comes, she's already sort of aiming toward Messiah. And Jesus answered her, I am the one speaking to you. And so we saw that sort of embedded claim to divinity in Jesus' conversation. And that's the first time Jesus answers that way, but it's not the last. There are 7 where Jesus says something and it will just be, I am. And our translators will usually put, I am he, but all of those times, there's no he in there. It's I am. And so we saw that connection to Yahweh, the name of God. Yeah, absolutely. And the woman goes back. Could this be the Christ? She brings people to Jesus. And we saw all those marks of discipleship that have run through the book of John for this woman and eventually for her whole village. Yeah. Go ahead, Sandy.
Well, in neither one were looking for a mate at the well.
Okay, so we saw that so Sandy said neither one is looking for a mate at the well. Yeah. We saw that the setup at the well would have reminded the ancient reader of Rebecca's of Isaac's servant finding Rebecca at the well, of Moses meeting Zipporah at the well, of who was the third one? Jacob meeting Rachel at the well, right? So those that setup would have been like, are we finding a bride here? And yet we saw that Jesus was not there to find a bride, but rather a disciple out of this woman and out of her Samaritan village. And through these unexpected people, we see sort of the foundations of the church, the bride of Christ. Yeah, great point. What else?
Well, it was a teaching experience for Jesus to be able to talk to her. And then she went and was, I don't know if evangelist is the right word, but she passed information on.
Well, it does say testimony, right? Yes, it says that she had a testimony, right? So great. So Jesus teaches, and then she has her testimony of Jesus teaching. And we saw that Jesus taught about more, right? He taught about he sort of swept away the division that has been important in Scripture for years about worshiping in Jerusalem. He said that's not what's going to matter. The historic place of worship is not what's going to matter. The historic racial, ethnic divisions are not what's going to matter. And he talked about the coming of the Spirit. Yeah. Sandy.
And he was offering living water instead of well water.
Living water, yeah. It's this living water is that by which you can be cleansed to come into the presence of God. And that idea that Jesus restores us so that we can come into the presence of God, that thread is going to continue through today's lesson as well. So let's get into it. I'm excited about it. All right. I think we covered all our review. You guys are so good. John has now taken us through these 4 institutions in which Jesus replaces the theological function of the institution with himself, right? So that he is the new host of the Messianic banquet, the new temple where God dwells among us, the new rabbi and teacher of Israel, and the new center of worship for the people of God. So let's turn to the next section of John. Please read someone John 5, 1 through 9, if you would.
Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which is in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. There a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's do a technical note before we continue.
Is that a little bit?
Do you have a verse missing?
There's a little bit more. Mine says the day on which this took place was a Sabbath.
Yes, okay,
I have a
okay.
break there.
There's a paragraph break in mine as well, and then the verse continues. All right. So you may notice that verse 4 is missing in that text. Some of your texts will have it, and some will not. Some will relegate it to a footnote.
It has a footnote.
Okay. So that text is the last line of the last phrase in verse 3, waiting for the moving of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water, and whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease he was afflicted. So this is material that is likely not original, right? The oldest manuscripts and best manuscripts do not have this material, and yet it was added by some helpful scribe explaining what's going on, right? So that's the reason I read it to you, is because it's quite helpful to understand what's going on here. Verse 1, you'll notice it's after these things or sometime later, and chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7 all begin with that same phrase. So what we have is John sort of connecting, we've seen this before, John wants to connect his events by his theological plan, his thematic plan for how his book is written, rather than necessarily chronologically. And so we get just kind of this vague statement after these things. So we're getting a clue that this is, chronology is not the important part here. And we notice Jesus went up to Jerusalem for what? Verse 1.
The festivals.
A feast, a festival, right? It doesn't say which one. And that's because the festival is not the important element here. We find out at the end of verse 9 what the important element is, right? What is the important feast, only it's not a feast. What's the important religious occasion? The Sabbath, right? Okay, so the feast is probably, deliberately left out because the focus is on the Sabbath in this section. All right, what is the scene at Bethesda? What's going on there?
Sick people trying to get well.
A lot of sick people. They're gathered around the pool and they're in need of healing, and they want to use this pool for healing. Bethesda means house of mercy. So Beth it's Bet, and you put the TH on, but it's house of. And then, so there's lots of, Bethlehem is house of bread, lots of Beths in these names of places in the Bible. And this is house of Hesed, of mercy, of the great covenant loyalty of God. This is the house of Hesed, the deep loving faithfulness of God. And so some translations may give you Bethzada or Bethsaida. These the early manuscripts vary, but it's thought that Bethesda is the kind of the best manuscript translation there. So who does Jesus speak to in verse 5?
A man who's been like 38 years.
38 years, a man who had been ill, it calls him an invalid. He had been in his sickness for 38 years. So what does Jesus ask him?
If he wanted to get well.
Do you want to get well? Why do you suppose Jesus asked that? Isn't that obvious? Wouldn't anyone want to get well?
Not necessarily.
Okay, not necessarily. Say,
Because he was probably begging as well, it could be a source of income that he did not have, and it had been going on so long that this was almost an institutionalized situation for him that may have possibly been beneficial.
how could he, and even if it wasn't beneficial, how could he start over after 38 years? Yeah, it's so, what a difficulty. I mean, it would be a very difficult situation to find your whole life circumstance changed after being an invalid for 38 years. And so Jesus gives, what we might call an invitation to think about, do you want to get well? And maybe this man had to decide if being able-bodied was a change he could handle. And we know that Jesus knows what is inside a man. And so maybe Jesus was speaking to that question. Are you ready for transformation? And we can't help but notice, does the man answer the question? He answers, but does he answer the question? He doesn't. He has excuses, he has explanations, but he doesn't actually answer the question, right? It's a hard question. How does Jesus heal this man?
He just speaks to us.
Okay, with his word alone, right? So we are seeing, we always remember that the prologue informs everything that we're reading in John. And so with his word alone is the way that Jesus heals this man. And the word is get up or arise. It's the same word for raise up the temple in 3 days, or when he was raised from the dead, that same word. So it's arise. And he tells him, what does he tell him to do when he arises?
Walk.
Take his mat.
Okay, walk and also carry your mat, right? Now, it's a dramatic reveal at this point, because now is the point that the author tells us, now it was the Sabbath. And so we're meant, if we were Jewish, ancient Jews, we would go, oh, because why? What's the problem with the mat carrying? It's work. It's not allowed. Now, it's interesting that someone would be allowed to carry this man on his mat, because, that, like, if you are an invalid, maybe a paralytic, because the instruction is get up and walk, then you need carried every day. You can't just skip a day, right? You got to get to the bathroom, to the place where you can maybe be healed. You got to get back and forth, right? And so people could have carried him, but for him to be able-bodied and carry his mat was not allowed on the Sabbath. So why do you think Jesus told him to do that?
Wanted that confrontation with the rabbis.
Okay, so you think he was instigating. Jesus was instigating a confrontation. What do you think, Sharon? I see your mind going.
Yeah, well, it was because of something I read in there that they're not worried so much about the rule following as the doing good and the healing.
Okay. So this is why Jesus might want that confrontation with authorities. Why is he bringing this question to a head, which this action would do? Maybe to address, what does it mean? What is the Sabbath for? what does it mean to do good? And so we're going to continue to explore that question as we go on. All right, let's read 10 through 19. When you get to 19, you'll be stopping in the middle of a paragraph because we don't have time to do the whole following section, but 18 and 19 are parallel to 16 and 17. They're repeat verses, and so we want to compare them. So if you would go through 19, please.
And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. So, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus gave them this answer, "I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son does also."
Okay, thank you. All right, so verse 10, let's go back to verse 10. What does, okay, well, first of all, when it says the Jews were saying, who are the Jews?
The leaders.
The leaders, right? We remember like everyone in these stories is Jewish. Well, not the Samaritan story, but many of these stories, everyone in there is Jewish. And when it says the Jews, we're talking about those in authority. So the Jewish religious leaders. So the Jews ask him, why, don't you know that's not allowed, right? And what does this man answer, verse 11? Okay, someone told me to do that. Who? The person who healed me. What do you think is implied in this man's answer? What's going on with his answer?
Maybe he didn't want to get involved.
Right, okay. He's like, it's not my fault, right? And one of my commentaries was a very, it kind of made me laugh because they were like really disgruntled at this guy for throwing Jesus under the bus instead of taking responsibility for his own actions, right? Like, it's not my fault. The one who made me well told me to. So he's like, sicking the authorities on Jesus was how they read it. I think there's another way to read it as well. What else do y'all think?
Maybe he's getting credit.
Okay,
to
credit.
Jesus for healing him, and that it was such an amazing act or event that it superseded any fine points.
Okay, would such an act supersede the previous authority about what is allowed on the Sabbath, right? So if Jesus has the ability to transform this man into wellness, then is it implied that Jesus has the authority to say whether he should carry his mat on the Sabbath, right? And this man, he didn't answer whether he wanted to get well, but he did obey Jesus and do what he said to do. And so we're seeing that progression. Chris, go ahead.
In other places, it is mentioned that Jesus spoke with authority. And so when he speaks with authority, people are going to listen. Also, he was known as a rabbi, so you're going to listen to what the rabbi says.
Yeah. And I think authority, so Chris says Jesus was known, and especially the synoptics talk about Jesus speaking with authority, and so he probably said it with authority, and and he's a rabbi. He's probably dressed as a rabbi. He's presented, he's out there healing and speaking with authority. And I think you've kind of hit on the heart of why I think that's the correct there's no correct because we're speculating a little bit, but that's makes sense to me because the leaders are mad about it, right? They do not like Jesus taking the authority that they feel is due themselves, right? They think that obedience is due to them, authority is owned by them, and for Jesus to take it really gets under their skin, doesn't it?
No,
Uh, Go ahead.
They also think that Jesus is taking God's authority.
Okay, and we're going to get there as well, because Jesus really doubles down on that here in a second. Yeah, Chris.
I know we stopped at verse 19, but I read on in verse 20.
That's allowed.
He did these things so that you may marvel.
Yeah.
And
These are marvelous things. They are
Yeah.
signs, and they point
Yeah.
to something.
Yeah.
Yeah, great point.
but not so that you can believe, but so you can marvel.
Well, Jesus had slipped away when the leaders had first confronted the man, but he now finds the man where?
In the temple.
In the temple. Why do you suppose this man was in the temple now?
So we hope he's thankful.
Okay, I missed it. What did you say?
I said, we hope he's thankful.
Thankful? Yeah, for any Jew, they might go and give a sacrifice for something like this. Would be a normal thing to do. Certain diseases required going and giving a sacrifice, but anyone might think that was a natural thing to go and sacrifice in thankfulness. What else was said?
Proving to the leaders of the temple that he had been cured.
Okay.
Which was also required for certain things.
Yeah, so you would go and present yourself to the leaders to say, I'm really cured. Now that was usually with like a skin disease, like leprosy. And the other thing about some of these diseases is people with them were not allowed in the temple.
They would be unclean.
They would be unclean. They would be considered flawed. What we really, in Leviticus 21, it gives restrictions for priests who have physical defects, physical illnesses, problems, not serving in the temple. But in this period, those limitations were often extended to the general population. And so maybe this man had not been allowed in the temple for 38 years. And so it may be that he was overjoyed, that he ran to the temple to enjoy the connection with the heart of Jewish life there in the Temple of Jerusalem. Yes, Sandy.
Well, it is the Sabbath, and shouldn't that be where he could be?
I don't know if he should be there on the Sabbath, because they would rest, they would prepare things the day before, but thankfulness, I think, yeah.
But there was a festival going on.
There was some festival going on, yeah, and those were often a week-long thing,
Right,
and so maybe part of the festival. Yeah, good point. Join in, and maybe he hadn't been able to join in. And so we think, Jesus not only healed this man, he restored his ability to participate in the community life of worship and to come into the presence of God in the temple.
Is there any cleansing ritual at the temple that you might have wanted to partake?
He might have done something like what they would do, a sacrifice after being cleansed, like leprosy, something like that. Yeah, he might have. And Jesus has instructions for the man. What are Jesus' instructions?
Stop sinning.
Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? Stop sinning.
It's kind of like the woman at the well. He knew her whole life, and now he knows this man's life too. Or something, and then he says, or something else will happen.
Right. So it's very interesting because was his original illness or disability caused by something, by sin, by something that he did?
There was a Jewish belief, and still is to this day, that sin is a result of, or illness is a result of sin.
Okay.
So that's kind of a long-running thread, whether it's true or not.
Okay.
It's still that belief.
So we're going to get into this next week too, because it really comes up with the man born blind, right? They really talk about this a lot. But yes, you're right. Jews in this period believed like very, very close association between individual calamity of whatever kind and like personal sin and responsibility, right? And Jesus challenges that in next week's passage. So be on the lookout for how Jesus treats that idea. And yet we see there is some connection here because Jesus says, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. So we're brought back to the idea that Jesus knows what is in a man and he encourages them. Pursue spiritual transformation to go with your physical transformation, right? Continue to come into the presence of God in a way that you can become whole. Yeah. Well, what is the result of all this for Jesus among the Jews in verse 16?
He's been identified as the healer.
He's what? Say that again?
Jesus has been identified now.
Okay, so if the man didn't throw Jesus under the bus to start with, but he does go report, that's who it was, right? So Jesus is identified, and because Jesus is identified as doing this and it's on the Sabbath, what then?
Persecuting.
They're after him. They're persecuting him. This word persecuting is interesting. It literally means to pursue or cause to flee, right? To chase down. But it has a lot of sort of parallel metaphorical uses, and one of them is to attack in a court of law or prosecute. So this is the opening of a prosecution of Jesus that will extend through the rest of the public ministry. In John, the Passion Week does not detail a Jewish trial and then a Roman trial like it does in the Synoptics. Like John, for example, or Mark, for example, like he goes to Jewish trial and then he goes in front of Pilate for the Roman trial. But what we see in John is that John has woven the Jewish trial into the rest of the first half of John. So this Jesus is now being prosecuted. And notice the parallel of verse 18. What is the goal of their persecution or prosecution of Jesus? What do they want to do? Kill him. Yeah, right? Like this is high stakes here. This is not a small thing to them. They want to kill him. They said it's because of the Sabbath, but what else is it because?
He was making himself equal with God.
Yes, okay. It says he was calling God his own father, which the Jews themselves do. In 841, they say we have God as our father when they're sort of having a little debate about where their lineage and how much it protects them in 841. They say God is our father, but here they say he's calling God his own father in a way that what? Makes him equal with God. Jesus is doing more than just calling God his own father in the same way that they were. It's a different way, isn't it? What is Jesus' explanations for his actions on the Sabbath in verse 17?
My Father is always at work to this very day. I too am working.
Okay. My Father is always at work. Well, now that is kind of a surprising line, isn't it? Okay, I thought God rested on the Sabbath. So what is going on with, and now Jesus is saying God is working on the Sabbath. So what is going on with that?
So this little note said,
A little louder.
if God stopped every kind of work on the Sabbath, nature would fall into chaos and sin would overrun the world. Genesis 2:2 says that God rested on the seventh day, but this can't mean that he stopped doing good. Jesus wanted to teach that when the opportunity to do good presents itself, it should not be ignored even on the Sabbath.
Okay, I like that. That's neat. All right, so let's break down that little neat section that Sharon read. Okay, so if we ask ourselves, but let's say when God first rested from the work of creation, God created, and then on the seventh day, God rested. We go, okay, did that mean God was really tired and he needed a nap or a break? Like, okay, that doesn't sound right. Go ahead.
I think that God was setting up a pattern or being a model for us, for man, that you should have one day that you are resting from your labors, but also dedicating that to God and worship or whatever. So he didn't need it for himself necessarily, but we needed it. And it came through, of course, the 10 Commandments as, one of the early commandments that you will rest on this day. So I think it's more a modeling, or it's a commandment that we
Yeah.
we rest.
So when
we dedicate ourselves, it's kind of twofold.
Okay, I like that. That's great. So so a couple of things here. So first we say, all right, when God rested on the seventh day, Carrie makes the point that God is modeling a pattern that God then instructs the people to keep by resting on the Sabbath, right? God says, I rested on the seventh day, so you rest on the certain. So that's definitely part of what's happening here. What did it mean for God to rest is an interesting question, right? Because it didn't mean to nap and it didn't mean to recover from tiredness. But we use, even in English, we use the word rest to mean different things, right? The Israelites received their inheritance rest in the promised land. Did that mean there was no work to do in the promised land? No, they still had to plow and, whatever, but the land was the place where they could settle and be secure. A king might establish, his boundaries by fighting however many battles, said about David, and then rest on his throne. And so what that king is doing is being at peace in his reign. Right? And so that is the sense in which God rests on the Sabbath, is that God is transitioning from creating the world to sustaining the world. God is at peace and satisfaction with the creation that has been made and is able to rest in that. And God, being on the throne, is the very reason that we are able to take a Sabbath rest. God's work is to sustain the world. I love the way that your little passage talked about it. The rabbis taught that and agreed in Jesus's time that God continuously sustained the world, holding it together by God's power, keeping it from falling apart because of the ill effects of sin, right? Sin in the world is a toxic and corrosive force that causes things to come apart. And if God didn't hold us together, we wouldn't stay together. And so God continuously sustains creation and does not cease to do this work on the Sabbath because God is the king reigning at all times. So God both rests on his throne and continues to sustain the world at all times. And the Sabbath is a celebration that we can rest because God is king. Okay, given that is the kind of work, like holding the world together is a big job. Did you want to say, Sam?
I was just going to say, mine referenced chapter 9, verse 4, where he said, I work the works of him that sent me.
Okay, Jesus will continue to talk about the work that Jesus does in imitation of, in cooperation of, in continuation of God's work. Yeah.
But he's saying, well, it's day because at night you don't work.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that passage too. Next lesson. Yeah, I had to think about how far out that was. Yeah, next lesson we'll talk specifically about that passage. It's kind of a little mini parable built into that sentence. Yeah. Okay, so If this is the kind of work that the Father does on the Sabbath, what is Jesus saying? He's doing the same work. What work is that? Sustaining and reigning over the world? Like, this is a big claim for Jesus to make. He says in verse 19, whatever the Father does, these things the Son does in like manner. And healing, as Jesus has just done, he says, that's part of the same kind of work that God does to hold together the world. So no wonder the Jewish authorities are offended by where he places himself in the order of creation, right? Right there with God, continuing the work of holding together the world. Okay, questions or comments on this passage? Because we're going to move to chapter 7.
I always wonder why that guy, because there was a lot of people at that pool every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
Why him?
Why him? And,
Well, I think it's because he already knew him.
True.
Because it just goes back, it's the same as the Samaritan. He knew her. He knew she had 5 husbands. He knew. So even though it doesn't tell us what this guy's life situation was, Jesus knew. It's like he picks out the ones who needs him most, maybe.
yeah.
I mean, we all need him, but you know what I mean?
Well, and I think you remember that these are curated stories, right? These don't tell us everything that happened. And in the Synoptics, there are all these passages where Jesus is healing the multitudes, right? And so we don't know that this is the only healing that took place on this day or at this place. We just know that this is the story that John wants to use to tell us who Jesus is. And so maybe those other people also had some of Jesus' attention, because we know Jesus healed very many people at multiple times.
Well, if he knew that, he would have known all the rest of it.
Yeah,
He knows us
yeah.
all.
And yet, not everything in life gets the miraculous healing that we wish it would, right? And so somewhere in there is our walk. And Jesus, he also did not escape suffering.
I'm thinking that maybe this person would be the most impactful because he has been ill so long, everyone knows this person.
Yeah,
They've either assisted him or seen him or whatever, and his healing would be even more amazing than someone else because
of the length.
maybe so far gone with his illness.
Yeah. So Carrie is saying that 38 years, maybe that this very long time is why John chooses this story to bring to us. And I think it really it tells a story about Jesus continuing to bless even those who have long time not been, and maybe this man not faithful.
And it kind
Right.
of foreshadows, healing from sin, and even to this day, someone can have this really long and horrible story, but when they come to faith, it's all gone.
Yeah.
But it's even more amazing to everyone because they've had such a hard time in life, or they've made things hard for themselves.
They develop a testimony.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're a powerful testimony because you can't, it's hard to believe that this has happened to this person, and it's so far to go.
There's that, and then there's also the significance of the number 38. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, two years at Mount Sinai and 38 years in the desert. And so, that number would have been noticeable to the original audience, that 38 years. Yeah. So, okay. We see the man at Bethesda has received the hesed, the covenant loyalty, the mercy of God, and it has kicked off the persecution and the prosecution of Jesus. In the next section, if you have been working on trying to understand this next section in the rest of chapter 5, this is a court, picture this as a courtroom scene where Jesus is talking about where his witnesses come from and what witness, it will say over and over, testimony is true. For our way that we think of the word true, replace that with valid. Testimony is valid or not valid, right? You can't testify to yourself. It doesn't mean you're lying. It means it's not valid, right? So this is a courtroom scene where Jesus is saying, these are the witnesses to my being who I say I am, the witness of John, the witness of my works, the witness of the Father, the witness of Scripture. And in the end, Jesus himself embodies everything of Scripture and the Father and the works, so that his testimony of himself becomes multiple testimony and justifies his the validity of that testimony. Okay, let's skip to chapter 7. And would someone please read verses 1 through 9?
After this, Jesus went around in Galilee, purposely staying away from Judea, because the Jews there were waiting to take his life. But when the Jewish feast of the Tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, "You ought to leave here and go to Judea, so that your disciples may see the miracles you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe in him. Therefore Jesus told them, the right time for me has not come yet. For you, any time is right. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that what it does is evil. You go to the feast. I am not, mine says yet, going up to this feast, because for me the right time has not yet come. Having said this, he stayed in Galilee. It doesn't say, though, how long he stayed in Galilee.
Right.
It does say
Yeah.
that he
Yeah.
had to go.
And I think it bothers us a little when it seems like, oh, is this deceptive? But I mean, well, we'll go in order. Okay. The Jews are trying to kill Jesus, it says. Like, that's the introductory statement. But it's a feast. This is the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. It celebrates them living in tents in the desert, and it's at the time of year when they would pull in harvests that would also require them to build shelters in the fields as they were bringing in the olives, and it's that time of year. So normally Jews would go up to the Jerusalem for this, and the brothers are saying, you should go. What do you think of their encouragement? What do you think about those brothers and what they say?
Well, it seems to me that they're saying that he's acting in secret, but he really didn't, because at the pool, that was public, very public.
Okay.
And it became very public, and they know now that, and that's why they're trying to kill him. So why are they still saying he's doing this in secret?
Okay. Why are they saying you should go to Jerusalem? You better be more public. Okay. The pool thing was entirely public, but now, see, remember that, like, the emphasis that, like, we're not necessarily getting all of Jesus's movements. However, right here, he's in Galilee. He's not in Jerusalem. And so they're saying you should go to Jerusalem for the publicity's sake, right? That's where it's at. If you're you're gonna make a bid for messiahship, that happens in Jerusalem, right? So what they're saying about him not being public is because he's in Galilee rather than in Jerusalem, which he's there because they're trying to kill him in Jerusalem, right? Okay. What else? What's that?
I know.
Look, I mean, he seems to be going about teaching maybe while he's in Galilee, especially if we look at the synoptics. But yeah, staying under the Jerusalem radar.
Because his time hasn't come yet.
Okay, because his time has not yet come. He's very focused on that, doesn't he? What else? What else do you think about the brothers?
The brothers don't really quite believe in him, so it's kind of like they're taunting him, well, if you're so good, go show yourself.
Knowing that they're brothers, we really can hear a taunt, can't we? I think that's a great point. Yeah. So they don't seem to think that, they don't quite believe in him. And in fact, we don't ever hear from the brothers again in John. They never show up again. So John's like done with the brothers after this, right? The text just said his life was in danger. So you got to wonder, do the brothers not believe his life is in danger? Are they like Joseph's brothers? Do they not care that his life is in danger? Right? Are they happy to get rid of him if his life is in danger? And so, they are like, you should just go do your publicity thing. But Jesus
Or
is.
do they not believe in his teaching?
I think yes, and I think that's what Pam was saying, is they don't seem to believe in his teachings, and I think you're right. I don't think they do believe in his teachings. It sounds like that from this passage. Go ahead, Chris.
Also, he was the oldest son, and he should have been doing the carpentry or masonry or whatever it was that Joseph did. So, in a way, they're saying, well, if you're not going to do what your dad did, why don't you go do what you're saying, your father was saying you did. A taunt, as they're saying, but also putting him down a bit for not following in Joseph's footsteps.
Maybe so. And when we look back in 642, they're saying, don't we know this? Isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? So maybe his teachings and traveling and everything he was doing was not bringing the attention that was enjoyable onto his family, right? So yeah, I think that's a good question. Let's read 10 through 20. Would someone read those?
But when his brethren were gone up, then went he also up into the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. Then the Jews saw him at the feast and said, where is he? And there was much murmuring among the people concerning him. For some said, he is a good man. Others said, nay, he deceiveth the people. Howbeit no man spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Now about the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, how knows this man letters, having never learned? Jesus answered them and said, my doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. If any man will do his will, he will know the doctrine, whether it be of God, or whether I speak of myself. He that speaketh of himself seeks his own glory, but he that seeks his glory that sent him, the same is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keeps the law? Why go you about to kill me? The people answered and said, thou hast a devil. Who goes about to kill him?
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, so verse 10, what does Jesus do? He goes to the feast in secret, but he goes in secret. Okay, what do you think it means for him to go in secret? What does that look like? How would he go in secret? What'd you say?
Disguise.
In disguise? We don't know.
Cloak, maybe not.
Without his entourage.
Without his entourage, maybe?
Maybe he just blended in with the group of people who were headed that way, he just kind
Okay.
of fell in with
Right, okay.
everyone going to
So,
this festival.
right, so definitely secret from the brothers, right? And then also, go ahead. Maybe without his rabbi guard. Maybe he just blends into the group. He doesn't maybe have his entourage. He isn't maybe dressed as a rabbi. He isn't announcing who he is, right? Because look, in verse 11, he's there, but the Jews, meaning Jewish religious authorities, are like looking for him and they're looking for informants, aren't they? They're asking around. And what do the people say? Verse 12 and 13.
He was a good man.
Some.
Some say he's good, some say he's not.
Some say he is, some say he's not. It says that they're grumbling. It uses a word like Israel in the wilderness, right? They're grumbling. They're discussing him and they are divided on their opinion. But even though they're divided on their opinion, they don't say openly why. For fear of the Jews. They don't want to be the informers and they don't want to endanger themselves. So we see that this is a highly charged environment already. It is a dangerous place to be, and everyone is looking for Jesus and quietly asking about him. So verse 14, the middle of the feast, Jesus goes to the temple, he begins to teach, and what reaction does he get to his teaching? They're amazed. And what do they say? Yeah. Okay. They say he couldn't be educated, and by that they mean like formal rabbinic training. They say he must not have formal rabbinic training, so how is he know so much?
And how do they know he didn't have that training?
How do they know he didn't have that training? Right? Maybe because he's not dressed as a rabbi. Maybe because he doesn't have his disciple. Maybe these very things that make him in secret are creating this situation where they think, well, he must not be trained. Jesus, this is a funny answer. He basically says, sure, I went to school. I went to school in heaven. Right? Like, I was with God when I got my degree. So you might not be able to get a transcript, He also says doing God's will is what will enable someone to recognize his teaching as being from God, right? And he says you're trying to kill me. And what do they say? You're demon possessed. What does that mean to them? You're crazy. That's exactly it. The response that they give is our equivalent of you're crazy. Who's trying to kill you? Nobody's trying to kill you. You're nuts. That's the response they give. You notice that he mentions Moses. Okay, so Moses give you the law, yet none of you carries out the law. Meaning, you're trying to kill me because you say I made a breach of the law. But Moses forbade murder, so are you even? Moses being shorthand for everything that's in the Jewish religious code, right? Everything that's law. Okay, so that's why he mentions Moses. But they say, you're crazy. Who's trying to kill you? And when we think about him going in secret, them not thinking he was educated. He's not gotten that response in the past when he taught. We've seen him teach in several times. He hasn't gotten that response in the past. And their astonishment that they say they're trying to kill him, they don't know who he is. They don't know he's Jesus. He's gone there in secret. So they don't know until look at 21 through 24. I did one deed, Jesus says in 21, and then 24. I made an entire man well on the Sabbath. We'll come back to the middle section because the middle section is a little complicated. We need background information to understand that middle section. But this, I made a man well on the Sabbath. This is where Jesus reveals he is the notorious Sabbath healer from Bethesda, right? From the pool at Bethesda. This is where he says, and so then that's why in verse 25, they went from, you're crazy, no one's trying to kill you, to, oh, is this the guy they're trying to kill? Now they know who he is, right? And Jesus' brothers have said that no one who wants to be a public figure does things in secret. Jesus chose to go in secret and teach as an unknown figure until the right time to reveal himself. And here is where he reveals himself. Questions or comments on that? It makes sense of some weirdness in here, right? Okay, let's look at more weirdness. The middle part in 21 through 24. Okay. Jesus says, Moses gave you circumcision. And they said, well, okay, it was from Abraham, but, it's in the law of Moses, so we call it Moses. You circumcise on the Sabbath, so shouldn't I heal on the Sabbath? And we're going, wait, what does circumcision have to do with anything here, right? And we need a little background to understand this part. So we remember that the rabbis acknowledge that God is always doing the work of sustaining the world, right? In addition, the rabbis would reason, on the Sabbath, people are born and people die. You might wish to put it off to the next day or get it done the day before, but you don't have control over that. God does, and God has the beginnings and endings of life on the Sabbath. And so God does the work of life and death on the Sabbath. And they said that principle should then govern our behavior. And so the rabbis permitted the saving of a life on a Sabbath. Remember in the synopsis where Jesus says, well, if your ox fell into a pit, you would pull him out. So they would do something to save a life, but they wouldn't do anything that they did not consider a matter of life and death. They just drew the line, except here's where circumcision comes in. When is the baby circumcised? On the 8th day. What happens when the 8th day falls on the Sabbath? They still circumcise. It was a conflict, and they worked it out this way. They said, circumcision perfects the man. Circumcision makes the person, the baby boy, into someone with a sign of the people of God. And so since circumcision perfects the man, it should be done on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, my making an entire man well is just like that. It's a way of bringing life and perfecting the person, even more than circumcision. And so Jesus is claiming the prerogative of God to do more on the Sabbath, to bring life in every way, right? Not just in matters that they would think of as life or death, but in matters of healing. He says, I have the authority that God has. I can make the entire man well on the Sabbath. And so that's why in verse 26, they go, ooh, do the rulers think this guy is the Christ? Right? Because of this big claim. And so his claim to say, I can do the work of God. I have more authority than you have ever imagined to make life and make well and make whole on the Sabbath. And that's why they say, is this the Messiah? So the crucial question is now, who is Jesus? And Jesus responds with a key characteristic about himself that he has been saying all along, right? What does he cry out in the temple, 28 and 29? Did we even read that? Did we go that far?
We did.
We did not. Let's do it. Let me get that. Okay, so who's trying to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one deed, and you all marvel, and for this reason Moses is giving you circumcision, not because it's from Moses, but from the fathers, but on the Sabbath you circumcise a man. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. And they were probably just judging his teaching based on appearance, right? But he says, judge with righteous judgment. Verse 25. So some of the people in Jerusalem were saying, is this not the man they were seeking to kill? Look, he's speaking publicly, and they are saying nothing to him. The rulers do not really know that this is the Christ, do they? However, we know where this man is from, But whenever the Christ may come, no one knows where he is from. This was one of many conflicting messianic expectations of the time. And this comes out of Enoch and 4th Ezra. So we wouldn't necessarily know these if you haven't studied the Apocrypha, those additional books. But there was the idea that we don't know where the Christ was from. There was also the idea that the Christ would be from Bethlehem, and that shows up in a later passage, right? Then Jesus cried out in the temple, teaching and saying, "You both know me and know where I am from. I have not come of myself, but he who has sent me is true, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him, and they sent me." So they were seeking to seize him, yet no man laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Okay, so what does Jesus say about who he is? Who is Jesus? What does he say?
He didn't come for himself, he comes for the one that sent him.
Okay, so the crucial fact about Jesus that he has been saying all along is that he is from God, right? That's what he says. You don't recognize me because you don't know God, but you could, if you believed my teaching, if you stepped into the light, let's put it in Nicodemus terms, right? If you came into the light, into the truth of God, he who sent me is true, then you would know me, right? It ties in with Jesus' last statement about himself in 16 through 18, right? My teaching is not mine, but him who sent me, right? He says, if anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it's from God or whether I speak from myself. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true. That's Jesus, right? Who's seeking the glory of the one who sent him? Jesus is. God sent him, right? He's saying, he's speaking of himself in the third person, so it gets confusing. Jesus is seeking the glory of God who sent him. Jesus is true. He is, his testimony is valid. He is good, and there is no unrighteousness in him. And we know from the prologue that Jesus' glory is the glory of the only begotten from the Father. And that glory, what does glory mean? Glory is the weight of the truth of God's nature. And when Jesus glorifies the Father, what he's doing is showing the truth of who God is in all of God's goodness. Questions or comments on this passage?
I think it's interesting that they were looking for him to kill him, but nobody dared lay a hand on him.
And why not? His time had not yet come. Yeah.
But they don't know that.
They don't know. Yeah, there's it feels fraught. We can really feel how high the tensions are running, how much angst is running through this whole discussion and difficulty, because it really matters if Jesus is who he says he is. Right? Yeah, what else? Other thoughts on this passage? Well, we see that Jesus was never off mission, right? The brothers may have been off mission, but Jesus was always acting with the determination, and we see that with his intensity in avoiding the publicity scheme of his brothers. Jesus goes in secret. He teaches in anonymity, and no one even knows who he is until he tells of the work he did healing this man. And Jesus' work, he's very adamant about, is the Father's work. It's what God shows God's nature: healing, bring wholeness, restoring our ability to be with God. And it's such good news that God is always holding the world together. When it feels like the world is falling apart, right, which it feels like sometimes, it's because the world would be falling apart without God holding us together. It is the nature of the world as it exists with sin and death on the loose, to decay, to corrode, to constantly be trying to fall apart. And we feel it, don't we? And yet it's the work of God exemplified by Jesus here that holds it together. Thank God that he never stops working, because God is true and God is good. And Jesus came to do that very same work and to do it for you and me, because we're just like the world. We constantly need to be made well, to be restored, to be brought back into the presence of God. And so the mercy, the hesed, that Jesus shows is extended to us as well. The great covenant loyalty of God comes to us through Jesus Christ, who shows us mercy.
Jesus always gives God the glory. I don't come of myself, he always gives God the glory.
Yeah, and God then glorifies Jesus. And so what we have is constant relationship of love and mutual glorification. And Jesus is going to talk more about that, especially as we get down into like chapter 17 and what that means to us. Yeah. So that idea that Jesus is always showing the truth of who God is, and God is always showing the truth of who Jesus is, because they are the great I am who wants to draw us to themselves. Well, thank you for your great discussion today. Next week, we will be doing Jesus heals the man born blind in John 9 and 10. So I'll be looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna, for another great lesson. These are just wonderful when you dig into the scripture and see how it all plays out. It's just amazing.
Exciting.